Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever stood in the middle of a bustling market, maybe watched the absolute frenzy of a stock exchange, or honestly just looked at the price tag on your favorite loaf of bread and thought, how exactly did they land on that specific number? Well, at its core, any market is essentially a massive ongoing tug-of-war. It's this intense pull between the people who want to buy and the people who want to sell. And today, we are exploring the fascinating mechanics of that exact tug-of-war. Okay? Let's dive into this and uncover the hidden architecture of prices, supply, and demand through the lens of economic equilibrium.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll be looking at the meaning of equilibrium, time, scope, and change, where supply meets demand, schedules and intersecting curves, types of market structures, and finally revenue and market conditions. All right, let's get right into it.
Section 1. The meaning of equilibrium, defining the balance. Because before we can jump into talking about money, revenues, or specific markets, we really have to understand the foundational rule of opposing forces that runs in the background of all economic activity.
Think of equilibrium kind of like a pendulum, finally coming to a stop. It's a position where opposing economic forces have perfectly balanced each other out. This leaves the whole system either completely at rest or moving along a very steady path. So the crucial point is that if prices are too high or too low, inherent economic forces will generate conditions to literally pull the market back to this balanced state. If buyers want more than what's actually sitting on the shelves, well, prices tend to rise. And if sellers have produced way too much, prices tend to fall until that balance is naturally restored.
There is this fantastic quote from the British economist Lionel Robbins that hits the nail on the head. He said, "Equilibrium is just equilibrium. There is no penumbra of approbation about it." Now, this sounds a bit academic, right? But what he means is incredibly important for our analysis. Equilibrium is completely impartial. It isn't inherently good or bad. There's no moral judgment here. We just treat it as an objective, natural tendency of market forces trying to balance themselves out over time.
Moving to Section 2. Time, scope, and change. Viewing from different angles. Because as we're going to see, this concept of balance really isn't a one-size-fits-all scenario. It looks entirely different depending on how closely we zoom in and, crucially, how much the clock is ticking. You see, time is a massive factor in how this balance is reached. Imagine you're a seller dealing in highly perishable goods, like, say, fresh strawberries. If you have way too much stock, you can't exactly stash it in a warehouse for a year, right? You have to offload it instantly, taking whatever low price you can get. We call that momentary equilibrium. But what if a seller has a bit more time? Say they build wooden chairs and demand suddenly spikes. They can order more raw materials, maybe hire some extra hands. That's short-term equilibrium. And finally, if they have enough time to actually knock down walls, expand their factory, and buy entirely new equipment to meet that demand, that huge adjustment represents long-term equilibrium.
Now, aside from time, we also have to think about change and scope. If we pretend for a second that things like consumer tastes, our incomes, and the available labor pools stay perfectly frozen and unchanged, well, then we're looking at static equilibrium. But if we analyze those variables as they continuously shift and change over time in the real world, that's dynamic equilibrium. And regarding scope, think of it like a zoom lens on a camera. If we zoom all the way in to analyze just a single firm or one specific industry, that's microequilibrium. Zoom all the way out to capture the entire national or international economy, yep, that's macroequilibrium.
Let's step out of the theoretical realm for a bit. Section 3, where supply meets demand, intentions in the market. We are moving into the actual marketplace where commodities change hands and the real tug-of-war happens.
Okay, there is a massive misconception we need to clear up right now. When economists talk about supply and demand in the context of equilibrium, they are absolutely not looking in the rearview mirror at what was already sold. Instead, supply and demand are all about intentions. Make sense? Supply is actually a schedule of the various amounts a seller intends to make available at different anticipated prices, purely to maximize their profit. And demand? That's a schedule of what buyers intend to purchase at those various price points.
To really see this in action, let's look at this data. This is a schedule of intended supply and demand. And honestly, look at the drama unfolding here. At a super high anticipated price of 50 pies, sellers are eager. They want to supply 10. But buyers, they're only willing to grab 2. That is a huge mismatch. Then look down at the bottom. At a low 41 pies, buyers are scrambling for 11 units, but sellers are only willing to part with 1. But check out that exact middle row.
At exactly 46 pies, the intended supply is 6 units, and the intended demand is exactly 6 units. That right there is our sweet spot. That's the exact moment where the intentions of both opposing sides perfectly balance out.
Section 4. Schedules and intersecting curves. Visualizing the handshake. Let's move to and see how this builds from the rigid numbers on a simple table into dynamic, visual lines.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact same data we just looked at, just mapped out visually on a graph. The line marked DD, that's our demand curve. Notice how it slopes downwards? That's because buyers naturally want way more stuff when prices are lower. The line marked SS is our supply curve, sloping upwards because sellers want to supply more when the price is high. Now zero in on point P right in the center. That is the exact physical spot where the two curves cross at 46 paise for 6 units. Think about it. If the price accidentally jumps up to 48 paise, suddenly we have excess supply, and economic gravity pulls the price back down. If it drops to 44 paise, excess demand forces the price right back up. The market just naturally gravitates back to point P.
Welcome to Section 5, Types of Market Structures, the Rules of the Arena. So far, we've looked at the basic tug-of-war, but the actual environment where this happens, the economic arena, so to speak, completely changes the power dynamics between buyers and sellers. We call these market structures.
So what actually determines the structure of a given market? Well, it mostly comes down to a few very specific characteristics. First, simply, how many buyers and sellers are actually in the room? Then, what's the elasticity of demand? In plain English, that just means how sensitive are you, the buyer, to a price bump. Next, what is the nature of the product? Is it a totally unique invention, or are there a dozen exact substitutes sitting on the shelf next to it? And finally, freedom of entry. Literally, how easy is it for a brand new competitor to just walk into the market and start selling?
When you mix and match those characteristics, you end up with 4 main market structures. Now, perfect competition is kind of the absolute ideal. You have huge numbers of buyers and sellers, an identical product, and absolutely anyone can freely enter the market. But in the real world, we almost always see imperfect competition. Take monopolistic competition. That involves many sellers, but they have slightly differentiated products. Think of the different brands of soap at the store. Then there's an oligopoly, which has just a few massive sellers who heavily influence each other, like major commercial airlines. And finally, the monopoly. This is an arena with only one single seller, a totally unique product, and completely blocked entry for literally anyone else. For our final segment, Section 6, Revenue and Market Conditions, the Final Impact. We are going to tie everything together and reveal how these different market arenas physically alter the revenue a business can actually expect to make.
Okay, this is an absolutely crucial takeaway from our explainer today. We really need to connect these dots. We know a demand curve shows the various prices buyers are willing to pay for certain amounts of goods, right? Therefore, the demand curve is the buyer's price curve. But let's flip the script and think about it from the seller's point of view. The price that the buyer hands over is the exact same metric as the average revenue the supplier collects per unit, meaning the demand curve literally is the supplier's average revenue curve. They're exactly the same thing.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how that average revenue curve looks when a business is operating under perfect competition. See, because there are so many sellers and the products are identical, a single seller has absolutely zero control over the price. None. If they try to raise their price by even a single penny, buyers will instantly walk away and buy from the guy next door. Because of this harsh reality, their demand curve, and therefore their average revenue and marginal revenue curve, which is the money they make from selling just one extra unit, is forced into a perfectly horizontal, flat line. It doesn't matter if they sell 10 units or 10,000, the revenue per unit remains exactly the same. They simply have to accept the equilibrium price that the market dictates.
We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the swinging pendulum of momentary equilibrium to the completely flat revenue lines of perfect competition. But remember, economics isn't just some abstract theory drawn on a graph. It's happening every single time you open your wallet. Knowing what you know now about market structures, the ease of entry, and product differentiation, I want you to think about this. When you buy your morning coffee tomorrow, or when you log in to pay your monthly subscription to your favorite streaming service, what kind of market structure are you actually participating in? Are you feeding a monopoly, an oligopoly, or something else entirely? Keep an eye out for that invisible tug-of-war happening all around you. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.